About this time every year, somewhere around Martin Luther King Day and the beginning of Black History Month, white conservatives in the United States of America like to get themselves all stirred up about issues of race. And one of their favorite new techniques is to quote Martin Luther King's line from the I Have a Dream speech about believing that one day his children will be judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. Using that quote in an attempt to silence dissent, an attempt to silence the voices of black people and minorities who continue to speak out against racial injustice, as though somehow King's idea of a society in which people weren't judged by their skin color has A, come true, and B, that King would want black people and other minorities to just keep their mouths shut and not cause so much trouble. Is inherently ridiculous and one of the more cynical things that goes on in American politics these days. The idea that Martin Luther King Jr. would want people of color, or any people, to stop speaking out because we'd achieved some kind of colorblind society, or until we'd achieved some kind of colorblind society, is patently ridiculous. But we see Republican politicians, making these claims over and over and over again. So this is part of a myth that white people tell themselves to avoid having to confront the fact that we live in a racist country, that we live in a country where racism still affects people's opportunities, their ability to move up economically, socially, to have the basic ideas of secure housing, secure food, secure family, that we live in this kind of country, which a lot of white people like to believe that we have eliminated racism. They like to believe that racial discrimination plays no role in American society today. And they like to believe, and they claim, that we should live in a colorblind society and that they don't see color, and that Martin Luther King Jr. would want us to acknowledge that we live in a colorblind society. Neither part of this is true. First, MLK would have never supported the idea of not calling out racial injustice where he saw it, nor would he have believed that black people or other minority groups or other people of color should suppress celebrating achievements by black people or by other people of color. He just would not have done this. And so for white people to claim that Martin Luther King Jr. would be against celebrating the fact that for the first time in NFL history we'll have two black quarterbacks facing off against one another is patently ridiculous, and it becomes cynical and evil when those same white people basically say that by constantly, from their point of view, by making everything about race, that black people are actually causing more racism as they're stirring up white animosity. This is patently ridiculous. It puts the burden for racism not on the place where it belongs, on white people, but on the people speaking out against injustice, on the people celebrating achievements. Those are the people, according to these white conservatives, who are causing the racism. So second, we do not live in a colorblind society, far from it. And so I'm just going to go through some examples of what would not be true if we lived in a colorblind society. So if we lived in a colorblind society, gerrymandering, like you can see on this map right here, which shows U.S. congressional districts in and around the Houston area, gerrymandering for race like this would not go on. Notice that all the congressional districts have the majority of their territory, or almost the majority of their territory, lies outside of inner city Houston. And yet each one has a little wedge of inner city Houston. This is done specifically to divide black and minority votes up and to place these minority then black voters or minority voters in with a large group of suburban white voters to guarantee that representatives who represent white people go to Congress and not representatives who represent the interests of inner city or black people or minorities go to Congress. If we lived in a colorblind society, Republican legislatures would not gerrymander congressional districts for this purpose, but they do. If we lived in a colorblind society, we would not live in a society in which 13% of the population, that's the percentage made up of the American population that's black, in which 13% of the population of the United States made up 38% of the population in prisons in the United States. Black people, primarily black men, make up 38% of the prison population. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, yes, that's because, black people commit more crimes. Actually, black people, generally speaking, don't commit more crimes than other groups. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, that's because, black people live in a culture of poverty, or black culture has, devalued the family and morals and all those kind of things. Well, essentially, if that's what you're saying something racist. You're essentially saying that black people don't have the same values as white people, which is, patently ridiculous. All people have the same values. All people want to have secure homes, secure food, secure family. All people want those things. So to suggest that there is something wrong in black culture that is causing this criminal difference is inherently racist, and it overlooks the fact that policing goes on more in black neighborhoods, that black defendants are much more likely to be convicted than white defendants, that charges are less likely to be brought against white defendants, that white defendants usually have more economic resources, which they can prevent themselves from going to prison, etc. You are overlooking a tremendous amount of racism, which goes into making up the fact that black men, make up 38% of the prison population. If we lived in a colorblind, non-racist society, then when policemen killed black men like George Floyd, a black kid like Tamir Rice, or a black woman like Breonna Taylor, people who were either completely not guilty of any crime or certainly were not guilty of a crime which would result in the death penalty, that if we lived in a non-racist society, you wouldn't see white people and white politicians or white political pundits on TV or the newspaper or the internet attempting to justify these killings by saying things that were false, like George Floyd was on drugs. He was not. Saying that Tamir Rice was pointing a gun at people. He did have a toy gun, but last I checked, having a toy gun is not a crime. Or that Breonna Taylor's boyfriend should not have gotten out a gun when the police, without announcing themselves, burst into his apartment, and he believed that his home was being invaded, and then the police shot Breonna Taylor several times and then did nothing for 20 minutes while she bled to death. If you're trying to justify those kinds of actions, then I'm sorry to tell you, you don't actually believe in a colorblind society. You believe in a society in which black people deserve to be killed if they commit crimes, or if they're accused of committing crimes, or if they make a mistake. And I'm sorry to tell you, that's not a colorblind, non-racist society. If we lived in a colorblind, non-racist society, then Republican state governments, since the election of President Obama, wouldn't have been closing down polling stations in primarily black and minority neighborhoods in an effort to limit black and minority turnout in elections, and yet they have, and they continue to do that, going to the extremes here in Georgia of essentially saying you can't even bring people water who have to wait in line for hours and hours because there's so few places where they can go vote. If we lived in a colorblind society, that wouldn't be true, but it is true. If we lived in a colorblind society, Kyle Rittenhouse, who went to someplace in Wisconsin, I forget the name of it right now, and killed 2 people with an AR-15 style rifle because they confronted him, even though he wasn't a police officer. He killed 2 people. That guy is considered a hero by a large number of white people in the United States, and yet those same white people view Colin Kaepernick, whose only violation was to kneel in protest of police violence on the sidelines during the national anthem and football games. If we lived in a colorblind, non-racist society, Colin Kaepernick would not be a villain and Kyle Rittenhouse would not be seen as a hero. If we lived in a colorblind, non-racist society, when President Trump called African nations shithole nations and said we didn't want any more immigrants from shithole nations like those in Africa, but instead we wanted more immigrants from countries like Norway, people would have called out that racism and not supported him. But instead, white people overwhelmingly voted to return him to the White House in the 2020 election. If we lived in a colorblind, non-racist society, when President Trump said that immigrants who crossed the border into the United States were rapists and thugs and criminals and murderers, people would have called him out for the racist comment that is, and yet white people overwhelmingly voted to re-elect Trump president in 2020. Trump claims the 2020 presidential election was stolen for him, and he focuses his ire and the attention of his rabid followers on primarily black people and other minorities who are election officials in primarily black and minority voting districts, like the voting districts around Philadelphia and Atlanta and Milwaukee. If we lived in a country that wasn't racist and was truly colorblind, that would not have happened, and Republicans would not still be supporting him. But they are. If we lived in a colorblind, non-racist society, then when most white people heard the words welfare or single mothers, the image that popped into their mind wouldn't be of black people. It would be of white people who actually make up the majority of single mothers, single parent homes, and people on welfare in the United States of America. If we lived in a colorblind, non-racist society, then we wouldn't have had a president telling a white supremacist, white nationalist organization to stand by and then calling them to the Washington, D.C. and the Capitol, where they led a coordinated attack on the United States Capitol whose purpose was to keep Donald Trump in power. If we were a non-racist society, that kind of thing wouldn't happen, but it did. So please spare me the idea that racism has been eliminated in the United States, that the United States has become or achieved colorblind status. And please, for the love of God, stop trying to guilt or stop trying to silence black people, members of other minority groups, and other people who call out this injustice by claiming they are the source of the problem. We do not live in a colorblind society. We do not live in a society free of racism. Martin Luther King Jr. would not have wanted black people to silence themselves to make white people happy. Black people speaking out against injustice. Black people celebrating achievements of black Americans. Minority groups, other minority groups speaking out against injustice and celebrating achievements of their group are not the cause of racism. Their activism does not justify or create white racism. Saying we live in a non-racist, colorblind society is gaslighting. You're gaslighting members of minority groups, people of color, and you're gaslighting white people too. Believing that we live in a non-racist, colorblind society is delusional and perhaps intentionally delusional. Telling those most hurt by racism that by speaking out, they're causing racism is cruel. And using Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote about his daughter or his children being judged by the quality of their character and not the color of their skin in an attempt to silence those speaking out against racism, against discrimination, is cynical and evil. I look forward to your comments in the comment section below. And as always, thank you for watching.